Good day and greetings from Pretoria, South Africa. My name is Dr. Charles Cotter. I'm the Learning Navigator, the Change Management and Leadership in a Crisis online learning program, part of the e-learning series. This is an on-demand learning program and comprises of 6 modules. Each of the registered learners will receive a SlideShare presentation per module, and then also a detailed workbook which comprises the content, but also a series of learning activities, which I'll expect you to complete at the end of each of these modules. I think this is probably the best way of continuing the engagement and also to stimulate discussion between the Learning Navigator and the registered learners. As a form of introduction, I'd like to give you a quick overview of my professional pedigree. Essentially, I've been in the field of education, training, and development for the last 19 years. Of those 19, 15 as an independent contractor. I've been very privileged to have worked for over 140 different companies, both in the public and private sector. And of course, this stretches across 18 different countries and 4 different continents. My area of subject matter expertise is strategic management, change management, and also strategic human resources management. Before we start with Module 1, I'd like to give you a quick overview of the totality of the program. As I said, it comprises of 6 modules. And if I could just give you a quick overview of the key outcomes of each of the 6 modules. So Module 1 comprises of 2 key learning outcomes. First of all, is just to master the fundamental principles and best practices of change management. And the highlight of Module 1 is then to do a diagnostic activity where we look at the change readiness of organizations. There's 10 best practice research-based criteria, which we're going to use as a basis. And from this, we will then do a gap analysis and identify what are the strategies that we need to employ to close each of those 10 gaps. I think with the COVID-19 global pandemic, has really taught organizations a couple of valuable lessons. Firstly, that our risk management and mitigation strategies seem to be very ineffective. Our state of organizational readiness is quite alarmingly low, and also the future fitness of both management and employees, but also the future proofing of our business and operational models seems to be severely compromised. When we get to Module 2, we're going to look at the organizational transitional cycle, and this is the emotional and psychological states that employees move through during times of change, and in particular during a crisis. The very important role of management and leadership in navigating employees through these different psychological and emotional states to the most advanced stage, and that's ultimately the adoption and commitment towards change, I think is very pivotal. And we're going to unpack each of these 4 stages and also the critical role of change leadership in each of these 4 stages to facilitate this transition to the most advanced stage. We're also going to unpack transformational leadership, in particular contrast transactional with transformational leadership. And we're also going to look at the 4 key roles of transformational leadership in the context of crisis management. I'd like us to conclude Module 2 by looking at a case study in the mining industry. And I think the key outcome of this case study is how this organization utilized organizational culture and the inherent value system within the organization as the pivot towards change. When we get to Module 3, we're going to differentiate between Type O, that's opportunity, and Type D, that's danger-orientated employees. In fact, there's a questionnaire that I'd like you to complete, and you're welcome to share that with your team, to circulate it within your team. From this, we can identify the prognosis and look at how we can improve on the culture within the team so that we can be more receptive towards change, and that's essentially a more Type O orientated employee. So we're going to look at that and spend some time completing that questionnaire. I'd also like us to interrogate the reasons why employees resist change in your organization, and for each of these key reasons, I'd like us to employ a strategy on how to counteract or to mitigate each of those reasons. We're also going to look at 2 very important models when it comes to managing resistance to change. The first model is evergreen, and that is Cotter's 7 techniques on how to manage resistance to change. And we're also going to look at the 3-step approach adopted by Kurt Lewin. When we transition to module 4, we're going to look again at Cotter's 7-step organizational change management model, and a more contemporary and more recent model is, of course, that adopted by ProSci. I think most of us will acknowledge that ProSci are the global research thought leaders when it comes to change management. In fact, I'm going to be sharing some of their research findings in module 1 in terms of what are the challenges with regards to implementing change, what are the critical success factors, etc. And of course, what we're going to look at is their 3-step model. And of course, they've also developed a framework, the ADCAR framework, which is an acronym, and we're going to systematically unpack the 3-step process and see how we can apply the ADCAR framework. I'd like us to conclude module 4 by doing the second case study, and that again is going to help us to implement and apply some of the key lessons, the theoretical lessons that we would have unpacked up until that point. When we get to module 5 and 6 in particular, we're going to look at some of the more contemporary change management issues. I think a lot of organizations have adopted a remote working culture, a work from home culture. And I think there's 2 iconic companies that have been quite vocal recently, Google and Twitter, who have basically claimed that even post COVID-19, that the vast majority of the employees will continue to work from home. So working from home, this remote working culture creates many change management and leadership challenges. The first one that I'd like us to look at is, of course, how to improve the levels of employee engagement. So that emotional connection that people have, number 1, to their jobs, but also number 2, to the company that they serve. And of course, we're going to look at the strategies on how to enhance and how to unlock the potential of high levels of employee engagement. I think we all agree that Gallup are the global research thought leaders, and we're going to look at some of their strategies. And also Deloitte, they've developed the irresistible organizational model, and we're going to look at those factors. In fact, there's 20 sub-factors. We're going to look at that and see how we can harness those tools to unlock high levels of employee engagement. We're going to conclude module 5 by looking at some of the people and talent management challenges and strategies that organizations are confronted with this remote working culture, and in particular the impact that this has on productivity, that it has on motivation, and what can we do as change leaders to enhance the levels of productivity and motivation with this remote working culture. We're going to conclude this online learning program by looking at module 6. In module 6, we're going to focus on 2 key aspects. The issue, a very important issue, in fact, of employee wellness. I think a lot of organizations are finding it very challenging at the moment, dealing with heightened levels of employee stress, levels of depression have increased. Of course, this creates a high degree of unfamiliarity and a unique set of challenges that organizations are confronted with. And the worst thing that we can do is to go into crisis mode, into firefighting mode. We've got to remain level-headed. We've got to stay objective. We've got to stay rational in managing these challenges. We're going to conclude module 6 in this program by looking at the management of virtual teams and some of the tools and techniques that change leaders can use to optimize performance in the virtual team structure. Let's get started with module 1. Perhaps I could start off with module 1 by quoting Charles Darwin. It's not the strongest and the most intelligent who will survive, but those who can best manage change. I'd like to check whether you agree or disagree with the statement, and I also, by means of an email, just drop me an email and just give me an indication of why you agree or disagree with this particular statement. I think this is going to be the best way, post on-demand video clip, that we can stay in contact with one another and we can engage in constructive discussion. My take on this quote is that it amplifies the need at individual but also organizational level for us, number 1, to be far more agile. I think agility probably going forward, especially during a time of crisis, is probably going to be the number 1 competency that most of us as change leaders would require. And the second competency, which is then accentuated with this quote of Darwin, is of course the need to be resilient. And I think that bounceability, the ability to, when confronted with change, the ability to deal with that, the change hardiness, we're going to look at that during module 2, and how change leaders can employ a variety of different strategies to optimize the resilience and the change hardiness amongst their work teams, etc. So when we look at the fundamentals of change and change management, you'll see right at the front of your workbook, there's a clear definition of change. And I think it's very clear. It's got to do with the alteration in either an organizational structure or process or system, or even in the organizational culture and value system. And of course, change management is then the mechanisms and the processes and the tools that organizations use to effectively implement these processes and of course to achieve a desired end state, which is right at the front end, the visioning process of the change management process. We also need to look at the reasons and the forces and the factors which necessitate and compel organizations to change. And I think typically what most organizations would use is a SWOT analysis, where internally they would look at their strengths and weaknesses. And when they cast their net externally, they would look at opportunities and threats. I think that's very important. An alternative tool, of course, at a strategic level is to use a pestle analysis, where organizations would look at the political, the economic, the socio-cultural, the technological, the ecological, so that's the green environment, but also the legal business environment. And of course, this leads us to what's often used as the VUCA acronym. So the business environment today is very volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous. I think it's very important that organizations are constantly mindful of these forces and factors and how they incorporate them into their various operational, but also their business strategies. So we're going to unpack those different models, looking at it from an internal perspective, so the microenvironment, but also I'd like us to look at it from an external perspective. So when we put the microscope and we look at the external environment, the market environment, the macro environment, I think these are all very important factors that we need to consider. I'd also like us to look at the different metaphorical views of change. So essentially we have the whitewater rapids, we have the calm waters approach, and also contrast that with a different perspective, and that's either first or second order change. So as part of the learning activity, what I'd like you to do is to look at the synopsis and look at whether you regard what you're going through right now through organizational change processes. Would you regard that as whitewater rapids? Would you regard that as calm waters? Would you regard that as first order, second order change? And then just give me a quick justification as to what are the symptoms that would lend you to favor that particular perspective of change. We're going to conclude outcome 1 of module 1 by looking at the different areas of change. And there again, we're going to use an acronym SPOTS, which amplifies what these 5 areas of change are. And that's, of course, the strategy. I think you'll see when we get to the illustration of the model, you'll see strategy is at the center point. And I don't think it's coincidental, but we also have products and services. We have the organizational culture, the value system that we spoke about. We have technology, which is constantly changing. And of course, we also have structure. So the organizational design process is very important. And even when you look at the organizational culture, the organizational development specialists within our teams play a very pivotal role in that. So this is what we're going to look at when we unpack some of the fundamentals of change management principles. I often prefer to look at this model as a hierarchy, and you'll see right at the bottom is we often confronted with a number of challenges. This could be in the shape of different problems. It could emanate from operational level. It could emanate from customer-related challenges. But of course, these problems necessitate change. We cannot adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. We have to have a customized approach. We cannot regard change as just an ad hoc. Change has become the constant. Change has become the variable that is consistent in all organizational lives. And I think with challenges comes change. And I think what we have to realize that the nature, the gravity, the complexity of the change, like we said, the business environment is VUCA. It's certainly a business unusual type of change that we are confronted with right now. It certainly cannot be described as business as usual. And those companies that continue to operate in a business as usual kind of modality with similar strategies, I think they are doomed to fail in this kind of crisis that we find ourselves in. So with this change in this business unusual environment, it necessitates a shake-up, a kind of rocking of the boat. And this is where sometimes organizations need mavericks, pioneers, people that are outside of the box thinkers, people that can use a combination of both analytical, but also critical, but also conceptual and creative thinking. And in the process, that can generate solutions, innovative solutions architects. I think that is a very important role in all teams. And of course, this necessitates a shakeup. And of course, the pinnacle of this particular hierarchy is disruption. And we've spoken about disruption, and I think we will agree that it's a highly disrupted business world. As I said with my introduction, the business environment is described as volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous. And I think this puts a lot of pressure on organizational managers, organizational management teams, because at the end of the day, we have to stay competitive. That's strategy 101, maintaining a strategic competitive advantage. And this is the business reality that most organizations, if not all organizations, are confronted with today, this VUCA business environment. And of course, we need to have change management strategies that can insulate and almost protect the organization from the turbulence and the disruption within the business environment. Just to amplify those statements, I'd like to give you a quote. I was invited to speak at a conference last year, April 2019, and I mentioned this quote at the conference, and I'm just going to quote it very quickly. During times of radical and disruptive organizational change, business leaders need to articulate clarity and not confusion. I'll repeat that, clarity and not confusion. They need to facilitate employee emotional transition from concern to commitment, and they need to energize and not polarize. And I think these are three key roles. When we get to module 1 later on, the second outcome, and also when we look at module 2, we're going to unpack the change management and leadership role and contribution responsibilities in greater detail. So I think for me, for starters, it's very important. We need to articulate clarity and not confusion. When we get to module 2, we're going to look at the change transition cycle. Like I said, how do we navigate people from the initial stage of shock and denial and the heightened levels of resistance? How do we get people through to exploration? How do we get them through to adoption and ultimately commitment? I think this is very important. And during time of crisis in particular, energy levels tend to dissipate. Energy levels seem to be at an all-time low. And this is where the value of leadership is so important in how to extract, how to motivate, how to energize. And of course, the opposite of that is the polarization. I think this is something that change leaders need to significantly guard against. So one is often questioned as to what are the reasons or the factors, the forces, both internal and external, that necessitate organizations to change. So I think this is a very useful model to help us to understand both internally but also externally what are the factors that are driving change. So if we have a look at the model, we look at the inner perimeter, you'll see it's very clear that there could be a whole host of different internal organizational factors, everything from skills deficiencies, knowledge deficiencies, technology that needs to be upgraded, that needs to be changed. We know that 5G technology has recently been launched onto the business market. So organizations are now under pressure again to upgrade from 4G to 5G technology. Structure, we're going to look at the different areas of change, and I think structure, you'll agree with me, is always an area that is prone for change. Our administrative processes, our individual and group expectations. So the social capital, the value system, the culture collectively in organization, these are often very pivotal in necessitating change. And of course, when we look at the outer perimeter, it could come from our customers. Our customers are sometimes a very useful dashboard for change. They provide us with customer intelligence. Their needs tend to be constantly evolving, constantly changing. Customers, we know, tend to be very fickle. And of course, this requires us to stay on the cusp, the cutting edge of what these expectations and changes are. It could be global competition. We often hear the term global village. We're not operating in a vacuum. We're not operating in isolation. Even domestic and local economies are in some shape or form influenced by global competitive forces. Government, political influences, we know, are quite significant. It could be legislation, it could be government policy, it could be rules and regulations. We know globally right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, governments have been very instrumental in laying down a whole host of restrictions. And of course, this is sometimes negative on the economy. It's negative for stimulating business growth. It's negative for the different strategies that we were adopting given a particular scenario. And that's, of course, all changed. And I think the most proactive and the most progressive companies would use tools like scenario planning. They would be on the edge of the latest developments. They would use research intelligence to make sure that their strategies are indeed future-proof. So there's a whole host of factors, both politically, economically, technologically, and that's why I mentioned earlier on, I think a very basic tool that most organizations would use during a time of change, during a time of crisis, would be both a SWOT analysis, but also a pestle analysis. So the different metaphoric views of change, we have two distinctive views, and I think the illustration almost makes it self-explanatory. So the one option is the calm waters perspective. And I think that is typical of, a business environment where there's a lot of stability, there's a lot of rigidity, but in a more modern business environment, we often find that we find ourselves operating in a whitewater rapids kind of business environment. And I think you'll agree with me, during a time of crisis, probably a better descriptor, a more appropriate metaphor would be the whitewater rapids. And I think when we contrast this and we compare this with another perspective, and that of course is first and second order change. So when we look at first order change, essentially we're talking about evolutionary gradual change, usually localized. It's not at a macroeconomic level, it's not at a global level, it doesn't have major repercussions for other parts of the system. So again, what smart organizations would do is they would apply systems thinking. So they would understand that organizations are not immune to the influences of the external environment. And of course, again, when we look at describing first order change, we're looking at incremental change. If we contrast that with second order change, I think you'll agree that it's quite significantly different. So second order change, we're talking about radical, we're talking about revolutionary change, we're talking about the impact of change on the organization as a whole. So I think in summarizing, I think it's very clear that during times of radical change, during a time of crisis, we could probably describe that as either a whitewater rapids, or we could describe that as a second order type of change. So one of the learning activities, in fact, learning activity one of the questions that I'd like you to look at is to give me your perspective as to what your experience is, your change management experience. How would you describe the change that your organization is experiencing right now? Would you describe it as white water? Would you describe it as calm waters? Would it be first or second order change? And then, of course, to give me reasons as to why you would describe that particular change. Why would you use that descriptor? So a very good quote by probably the #1 management consultant in the world today, Tom Peters: excellent firms don't believe in excellence, only in constant improvement and constant change. I think this epitomizes the fact that organizations have to use quality assurance processes. They have to use quality management tools. I think when we reflect back the history of management, when we look at the late 80s and early 90s, we use tools like total quality management. We use business process reengineering. And I think business process reengineering, you'll recall, was a radical change. It basically dismantled organizations in its entirety and then would rebuild the organization. So almost the opposite of that would be what Tom Peters describes as this constant, this incremental type of change, which ties it very nicely with the Japanese philosophy. So this is what the Toyotas and the Nissans of the world, what they implemented, and their change management philosophy was based on what they called Kaizen. Now, loosely translated, Kai means change and Zen means good. So Kaizen is a continuous improvement process, and of course, it implies single-digit change. But the beauty of this Kaizen approach, the incremental change, is that the single-digit change, if implemented effectively over a prolonged time period, if there's consistency, then of course this leads to double-digit improvement. So I think whether we talk about what Tom Peters says in terms of the aspiration of organizations not to aspire to perfection and excellence, but rather to focus on constant improvement and constant change, or whether we call it Kaizen, the Japanese philosophy, I think it's very clear that organizations need to engage in constantly reinventing, re-engineering, modifying, adapting, staying on the cutting edge of the latest trends, the latest developments. Failing that, they're likely to go out of business. So I'd like to conclude outcome 1 of module 1 by looking at the model. We often refer to this as SPOTS, which is an acronym which stands for strategy. You'll see that's right at the center of the model, but also the products, alternative to products, if you're in the service-orientated industries. Also, the O stands for organizational culture. Like I said to you in the introduction, this is the people, the value system. Technology, I think you'll agree with me, technology probably the greatest accelerator of modern business change, and of course structure. So when you tackle the first learning activity, what I would like you to do is to unpack this model and look at the different areas of change. I think if you ask most business managers, so how many of these different areas of change are simultaneously at work in your organization? A lot of them will concede that all 5 are simultaneously, concurrently happening in the organization. Of course, this puts a lot of pressure on their change management processes. So simultaneously, their strategy is changing, their product service offering is changing, the organizational culture is changing, technology is changing, their structures constantly changing. So of course, this leads us to many different challenges. So these are the 3 questions that I spoke about. You'll find them in the workbook, which accompanies this on-demand video clip, module 1. And what I would like you to do is to work through each of these 3 questions. I'll go through them very shortly, and then to compile a very brief 2 to 3 page maximum essay and email it to me with your take on each of these 3 questions. I'm just going to run through it quickly. So question 1 is to look at both the internal and external forces that necessitate organizational change. I want you to give me an idea of how your organization has responded to these forces. Have you been proactive or have you been reactive? Have you been caught up in crisis mode, in firefighting mode, etc.? And then to give me some practical examples just to substantiate and support your response. Also, like I said, do you regard change as calm waters, as whitewater rapids, first order, second order change? I'd like your input in that regard. And like I said, going back to the SPOTS model, the area of organizational change, I'd like to hear your take on this, whether these are currently happening in your organization, and then to give me practical examples of how each of them influence change in the organization. So at this point, I'd like to summarize outcome one of module one. So we started off this module by looking at some of the fundamental change management principles, some of the best practice principles, looked at the definition of change. We looked at change management. Very important part of outcome one of module one is then to look at the different forces, both internal and external forces that are compelling organizations to change. And then, of course, how we've adapted to these driving forces, the tools that we use, the SWOT analysis, the PESTLE analysis. I think that's very important. Also, the different metaphorical views of change. Do we regard change as whitewater rapids, calm waters? Do we regard it as first, second order change? And I think very important critical success factor for effective change management is then to look at the critical success factors. And this is when we get to outcome two of module one. I'd like to share some of the research findings from ProSci. As I mentioned, they are the global research thought leaders. What are these critical success factors? And what I like about their research is that they differentiate between soft and the hard factors of change. I think that's very important. Then, of course, we concluded outcome one of module one by looking at the different areas of change. We use the SPOTS acronym. So we looked at how our strategies can change. I think most organizations have got 3-year strategies at the moment. And of course, the impact of a crisis and how this has a major influence on how they need to change, like business unusual, like I mentioned. Also, the people, products. I think in my industry, in learning development, we've had to go online. We've had to transition to becoming virtual trainers. So the product offering has had to change. The culture in organizations, very important, the value system. And that's also one of the questions that I'd like you to look at is, of those 5 areas of change, which one would you regard as the most challenging? Technology, we know most organizations on the cusp of upgrading from 4G to 5G technology. And of course, we need to look at structures. And I think we agree, and we're going to look at this later on in this particular online learning program. When we get to module 5 and 6, we're going to look at the decentralization of organizational structures. We've become virtual organizations. We start using networked organizational structures, and of course, the growth and the popularization of the virtual and remote working force, people working from home. I think more and more we're finding this is going to become the order of the day in organizations, and organizations who are not agile, who are not resilient, who do not adapt to the change, I think they might find themselves in serious business trouble.
This is Charles Cotter signing out. I'd like to thank you for watching the video clip, Change Management and Leadership in a Crisis online learning program. Please be on the lookout for subsequent uploads on my YouTube learning channel of the other modules. Also, please have a look at the chat box section. You'll see in the comment section. If you'd like to access a copy of the workbook in PDF format, I'll gladly email that to you for this specific module, but also the other modules of the various video clips. I'd also like to remind you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please press the notification bell to be alerted of the subsequent uploads of the other modules, and also like to encourage you to reach out and contact me. My contact details and social media presence will be provided on the screen very shortly, so I'd encourage you to reach out, and of course I would welcome any sort of communication or feedback regarding this video clip or any other learning content on my YouTube learning channel. Thank you. I appreciate your ongoing interest and active social media support. Thank you. You keep well. Bye-bye.